The photograph looks harmless at first. Just another damp grey day on a Maine dock, the kind of image that could have been taken 1,000 times and forgotten just as quickly. The colours have bled into themselves. Slate sky, iron sea, old timber turned nearly black with salt. In the foreground, 12 men stand in a loose, tired cluster near the edge of the pier. Their clothes are practical: rubber boots, knit caps, heavy sweaters under canvas jackets. Nothing staged, nothing heroic. No one smiles. No one meets the camera head-on. They look like men who woke up before dawn and are already thinking about the next tide. It surfaced in 2019 inside a warped shoebox at an estate cleanout in Portland. One of those unremarkable sales where strangers file through a dead person's life and pay a few dollars to carry pieces of it away. The box held receipts, a cracked compass, and a stack of photos wrapped in wax paper. Most were family holidays. One showed a wedding. Then came the dock. On the back, in blocky handwriting that didn't match the others, a date, October 1972. Under it, Harridan's Point, last clear shot. And below that, a name that stopped the buyer: Cold L.B. Kitteridge, the last name of a fisherman whose disappearance had been a local bruise for almost 50 years. The buyer was a high school history teacher named Evan Mallory, the kind of person who reads old newspapers for fun and can't pass a battered photograph without wondering who held the camera. He brought it to Ruth Wainwright, an archivist in Rockland who keeps the Coastal Historical Society's records from dissolving into mildew and rumor. Wainwright didn't need long to recognize the dock. She'd seen the shoreline in other images, and she'd heard the story the way everyone in the region had heard it. 12 fishermen went out and never came back. A sudden weather shift, a distress call that cut out, a search that turned up debris but no bodies. The sea, the official line said, does not return what it takes. That story has always had a strange comfort to it, tragic but clean. A storm is nobody's fault. The ocean is the ocean. Grief can at least take shape around an explanation. But the photograph refused to stay clean. Wainwright scanned it at high resolution, expecting to find nothing more than faces and rigging. Instead, the detail that mattered sat behind the men, half obscured by glare: the fishing boat's cabin window. Someone had left a mark there, dark, uneven, like grease pencil dragged in haste. Not a number, not a standard inspection note, not the neat paint of a vessel name, a symbol or a word broken into fragments as if whoever wrote it didn't have time to finish. Mallory enlarged the window until the pixels turned chunky and the glass looked like ice. The mark stayed stubbornly wrong, too deliberate to be a smudge, too placed to be accidental. And suddenly the image wasn't simply a memorial. It was a contradiction, because the official record, what families were told, what the newspapers printed, insisted the boat was secured at the dock that afternoon and didn't depart until later that night. Yet this marking suggested somebody interacted with the vessel after it should have been locked down, signed off, accounted for. Either the timeline was wrong or the wrong people were the ones writing it. To test that feeling, Wainwright called a retired Coast Guard coxswain, Thomas "Tom" Harlow, who had worked search and rescue off the Maine coast in the early 70s. Harlow listened, quiet for a long moment, then asked a question that made the room go cold. "Where'd you get the Coast Guard log entry that matches the press statement?" he said. Mallory admitted he hadn't. He'd only seen it referenced. "Then you don't have the record," Harlow replied. "You have the story." Within a week, Mallory found Cara Kitteridge, niece of the missing man, whose name was written on the back of the photograph. She had grown up with a family rule: don't ask too many questions, because questions don't bring anyone home. But when she saw the scan, she didn't look at the men first. She looked past them, straight to the cabin window. "My uncle used to say," she whispered, "that the sea isn't the only thing that can erase you." And that is where the photograph stops being a picture and becomes an accusation. 12 men on a dock, a boat behind them, and one strange marking on a window that shouldn't have been there, unless someone somewhere knew they were about to disappear. Just to confirm before I continue, for each section you want 3,600 characters total, including spaces and punctuation, right? I'm matching that below. Ruth Wainwright treated the photograph like evidence, not nostalgia. She started by stripping the story down to what could be measured: dates, tides, weather, radio traffic, paperwork. The local narrative said, "Sudden storm, but coastal storms leave fingerprints, barometer drops, small craft advisories, damaged boats in neighboring harbors, fishermen in other towns who remember fighting the same seas." If 12 men vanished, the ocean should have left a trail larger than rumor. She pulled the October 1972 issues of the Rockland paper from microfilm and laid them beside the statewide dailies. The headlines were dramatic, but the details were thin: repeated phrases, identical timelines, the same Coast Guard spokesperson quoted again and again. The articles described worsening conditions and heavy seas, yet one throwaway line in a later piece mentioned that visibility remained fair through early evening. That didn't fit the panic the story depended on. Mallory drove down to the docks at dawn and found the place that still functioned like an informal archive. The Fisherman's Co-op office, where old men drank coffee strong enough to strip paint and kept mental ledgers the state never bothered to record. A bookkeeper named Denise Arbor, young enough not to have lived it, old enough to have inherited the accounts, let him leaf through brittle binders, trip sheets, fuel invoices, ice purchases. One entry stopped him. The boat's fuel was topped off earlier than the newspaper timeline claimed, and the ice order was marked urgent, a notation typically used when a vessel planned to run farther or faster than usual. Then came the Coast Guard records, what could be found without asking permission. Wainwright requested the incident file the way archivists learn to, politely, precisely, and with an insistence that sounded like patience. The response arrived in a thin envelope, as if the government could reduce an absence to paperweight. Inside were photocopies, a typed summary, a few radio log excerpts, and a casualty form with most names spelled inconsistently. But the most important page, what Harlow had called the spine of the whole thing, was missing. The line where the official narrative got anchored, the first log entry of the night. Harlow, retired and careful, read what they did have and frowned at the phrasing. "This is cleaned up," he said. "This is after someone decided what the public should hear." He told them what an unpolished log looked like, timestamps that didn't line up, operators writing fast, shorthand, crossed out mistakes. The provided excerpts were too neat, too complete, like a transcript prepared for an audience, so they widened the net. Mallory requested National Weather Service archival data. Wainwright pulled buoy records and lighthouse keeper notes where they existed. The picture that formed was uncomfortable. Breezy, yes. Cold. A swell building offshore. But not the monstrous squall people described at funerals that never had bodies. Not enough, at least, to explain why an experienced crew would vanish without a sustained mayday. And the mayday itself, according to the public story, was brief. A burst of panic, then silence. But one local ham radio operator, still alive in a trailer inland, remembered something else. Not a distress call. A heated exchange on VHF, clipped and urgent, as if someone was arguing about whether to leave. He couldn't prove it, he admitted. He hadn't recorded it. But he remembered the tone because it didn't sound like weather. It sounded like people. Cara Kitteridge watched all of this like a person learning a second language, the language of institutions. She brought out her family's box, condolence letters, an insurance denial, a note from a priest thanking them for their acceptance. And one item she'd never understood as a child, a carbon copy of a complaint her aunt tried to file, claiming the boat had been released from the dock under pressure. The complaint went nowhere. No reply, no case number, just silence. When Mallory told her about the cabin window mark in the photograph, she didn't ask what it meant. She asked something sharper. "Who was on the dock with them?" she said. "That isn't in the picture." The storm was the easiest answer, so they tried to make it the true one. Ruth Wainwright wanted briefly for the data to click into place and let everyone go home with the same old conclusion. A rough night, a bad run of luck, the Atlantic doing what it does. Evan Mallory even drove to the nearest weather station and sat with a retired forecaster who still kept notebooks, as if pencil marks could settle a decades-old argument. The forecaster traced a finger along the archived chart for that week in October 1972. Pressure trends, wind direction, the slow breathing of the coastline. "It wasn't nothing," he said, "but it wasn't a killer squall, not the kind that eats 12 men whole without leaving a body." They hunted for the monster anyway, in harbourmaster reports from neighbouring towns, in Coast Guard station journals, in the logbooks of commercial vessels that had crossed the same waters. A trawler out of Booth Bay recorded chop, rising swell. A freighter offshore noted moderate seas, visibility good. The language never reached catastrophe, no widespread damage, no other disappearances, no strings of rescues that would have lit up the night. Still, the official narrative insisted there had been a distress call, short, frantic, cut off. That became the next anchor. If they could find the precise transmission, the rest might follow. Harlow pointed them towards something most civilians never consider. VHF traffic doesn't exist in a vacuum. When a mayday goes out, other stations respond, other boats hear it, operators write notes that aren't meant for the public. Cara Kitteridge joined them for the first time at the Historical Society, standing in the doorway like she was afraid the building might swallow her too. Wainwright played the role of translator, turning bureaucracy into plain English. "If the call happened," she told Cara, "it should echo somewhere." The echo they found was ugly and incomplete. A local newspaper had printed a quote claiming the Coast Guard received a mayday at a specific minute past 9. But the partial radio excerpts the Coast Guard mailed out didn't match that minute. The typed summary slid the timeline by nearly half an hour, and it did so without explanation, like someone smoothing a wrinkle in a sheet so the bed looks made. Mallory followed a false lead through insurance paperwork, convinced he'd uncover an obvious mechanical failure. Cracked hull, bad pump, known radio problem. Instead, he found something stranger, an adjuster's note from months earlier referencing outside interference at dock, a phrase so vague it could mean sabotage or an argument over paperwork. The file ended with a denial and a polite paragraph about unavoidable peril. Every trail kept returning to the same soft wall, not one decisive contradiction, but a pattern of small evasions, names misspelled, pages missing, times rounded off, and always the sea offered as the final excuse. It was Denise Arbour at the co-op who gave them the first solid fracture. She dug out a ledger supplement, a thin stapled packet that hadn't been filed with the rest. Inside was a tow charge entry dated the afternoon of the photograph, the kind of fee a boat incurs when someone moves it without running its own engine. There was no explanation, no signature, just a number, and a company name Mallory didn't recognize. When he brought it to Harlow, the retired coxswain went quiet again. "That company used to contract with federal enforcement sometimes," he said carefully. "Not always Coast Guard. Sometimes other folks." The room narrowed. Wainwright pulled up the high-resolution scan of the photograph and began to stare at it the way you stare at a locked door, willing it to open. She zoomed in past the faces, past the stacked traps, past the chipped paint on the hull. The cabin window filled the screen, salt-streaked glass, the dark mark, the suggestion of glare. Then she adjusted the contrast. The mark didn't become clearer, something else did. In the window's reflection, faint, almost swallowed by the grey, was a shape on the dock that did not belong to fishermen. A hard-edged silhouette, a man standing apart from the 12, posture straight, shoulders squared beneath a long coat. In his hand, a clipboard or folder, pale against the dark wool around him. And beside him, just within the reflective sliver, the angled front end of a vehicle, too low and clean to be a work truck, with a stripe that looked official when the pixels sharpened. Kara leaned in until her breath fogged the monitor. "That's not one of them," she said, voice flat with certainty. No one argued, because the photograph had always been presented as a last moment of ordinary life. 12 men, their boat, the sea. But now it held a 13th presence, someone just outside the frame, close enough to be there, important enough to cast himself into the glass. And suddenly the central question changed. It was no longer only what happened out on the water. It was what happened on the dock, before the boat ever left. By the time the reflection emerged from the glass, the case stopped feeling like folklore and started feeling like paperwork with blood on it. Wainwright didn't announce what she was thinking. She simply began filing requests the way a person might begin stacking sandbags, methodical, resigned, preparing for something heavy to hit. The first real break didn't come from Maine at all. It came from a misfiled federal docket Mallory found through a retired librarian who still knew how to read the margins of the system. A coastal enforcement operation had been active that month, quietly, aggressively, targeting a smuggling corridor that ran along the same shoreline the fishermen worked. Not pirates, not ghosts, men with clean shoes and badges that didn't like being photographed. Harlow confirmed what he could without saying too much. In the early 70s, overlapping agencies patrolled the coast like rival constellations. Customs, federal narcotics, occasional FBI involvement when money and ports tangled together. They borrowed boats, he said, voice low. They leaned on people who didn't have lawyers. And when something went wrong, they didn't write it down where you could find it. That tow charge entry, unexplained, unsigned, began to look less like bookkeeping and more like an order. A vessel moved without its own engine. A boat released under pressure, just as Kara's aunt had tried to report. And the cabin window mark in the photograph, once a meaningless scribble, started to resemble an internal signal, an improvised tag, a quick identifier, something meant for a small circle of men who already knew what it meant. Kara took the scan to the last surviving man who'd worked that dock in 1972 and still trusted his own memory. He was nearly 90, hands swollen, eyes sharp as fishhooks. He didn't recognize every face. Time had eaten some of them, but when Kara asked about the window, he nodded like he'd been waiting for someone to finally ask the correct question. "That's not a fisherman's mark," he said. "That's somebody telling somebody else. This one's ours." The Historical Society room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a family stops pretending. The old storm story, the clean tragedy, began to fall apart under its own convenience. If the boat left under official pressure, then the sea wasn't the only force at work. The disappearance wasn't just weather, it was a decision. Wainwright pushed for the missing Coast Guard log entry again, this time attaching the new evidence. The tow charge, the altered timestamp discrepancies, the reflected figure, the family complaint. What came back was not the page they wanted. It was a denial wrapped in sterile language. Records unavailable, records incomplete, records exempt. The message was clear in its politeness. You are too late to prove anything. But being too late didn't mean being wrong. Mallory laid the photograph beside everything they'd gathered and asked himself what it actually proved. Not the exact moment the men died, not the precise coordinates of their last breath. The picture proved something more terrifying, that the disappearance had been handled like a situation to be managed, not a catastrophe to be mourned. It proved an unlisted presence on the dock. It proved interaction with the boat outside the public timeline. It proved that the official story had been designed to close a wound quickly, even if the truth was still bleeding underneath. Kara's grief changed shape. For decades, her family had mourned a force of nature. Now they had to mourn a system, one that could quietly commandeer working men's lives, and then, when the ocean swallowed the evidence, let the sea take the blame. She didn't ask for revenge. She asked for a sentence that no agency ever wanted to give a fishing family in 1972. We were involved. In the end, the revelation was not a confession stamped with a seal. It was a reconstruction strong enough to stand in daylight. A boat likely pressured into service. A coastal operation that needed plausible deniability. A departure that may not have been voluntary. A disappearance that became, conveniently, weather. The photograph returned to Harridan's Point in a cheap frame at a small memorial service the town had never properly held. People stood on the same kind of dockboards, listening to waves slap wood, and watched Kara place the image down like an offering. The red-circled window wasn't just a clue anymore. It was a bruise preserved in ink and salt. The mystery doesn't end with a body recovered or a file opened. It ends with a clearer outline of what stole those men, not only the Atlantic, but the quiet machinery that decides whose absence matters enough to record, and whose can be filed away as an act of God.